Hey everybody, it's Andy from Estella's Revenge. And now that the Dewey's Readathon is over, I kind of find that my reading has had a jolt. My reading mojo is a little bit better than it was. And so while it had been quite a long time since I finished a book before the readathon, I have finished 2.5 since. So one of those is Bastard Out of Carolina by Dorothy Allison. And I had been reading this one for a while when the readathon came around, but I found that I was reading it rather slowly. This is a book that I picked up on the recommendation of Mercedes from Mercy's Bookish Musings and Stephen from Steve Reads Books. And wow. Just wow. I've had this book on my TBR forever, and I'm so glad that I finally picked it up. I kind of did have a mixed bag of emotions as I read this book, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that. It is set in Greenville, South Carolina. It is about a little girl who goes by the name of Bone and her family, the Boatwright family. She is a bastard. It is labeled as such on her birth certificate, and that is something that drives her mom absolutely crazy. Because she doesn't want her daughter to be labeled that way. And so in the beginning of the book, her mom, Annie, spends quite a bit of time trying to obliterate that annotation from Bone's birth certificate. And we find out through this process that Annie was married to a very nice man named Earl after Bone was born. She also has a sister named Reese, and then Earl, I can't remember if he passed away or was killed. I believe he was killed. And so then Annie's mother goes for a very long time without any relationships or anything. But slowly but surely she falls in love with a man named Glenn. And Glenn has issues. Glenn is the problem. He's one of the big conflicts in this novel. Glenn is described on the back of the book as cold as death, mean as a snake, and twice as twisty. And the bottom line is that Glenn is angry. He has a bad relationship with his family. He feels like less in comparison to his family. He has a hard time holding down a job. He loves Annie and the girls, but in an obsessive kind of way. And he seems to target Bone because she's quite hard-headed and assertive, and he begins to abuse her. Now, I expected the abuse to be very, for lack of a better word, hardcore and hard to stomach throughout the whole thing. That was not the case to the extent that I was afraid of. He does molest Bone. It doesn't happen all the way through the book. There's a couple of instances. And then there's a bigger, badder instance that is kind of the biggest conflict, the biggest climax in the book. And it was really hard to read, but there were other things in the book that were just as important, that weighed just as heavily as the abuse. So we see Bone's life, of course, through her eyes. She is the focalizer of this novel. And we get to know her aunts really well. The Boatwright family is quite large. And specifically, we get to know her Aunt Raylene and her Aunt Ruth very well. We get to know her uncles very well. They're kind of the father figures in the book, aside from Daddy Glenn. And it's funny because even though I did not have any sort of, abusive upbringing or anything, this book really took me back to my childhood. I grew up in the rural Southwest in Texas, and it was not very different from what is portrayed in this book. We were not rich people by any stretch of the imagination. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and, I grew up on the cusp of the digital age. So when I was a little girl, we had to physically turn the channel on the TV. I was the remote. We didn't get a VCR until I was in, elementary school. For fun, my grandfather would bring me animals. He'd bring me like rabbits and turtles and stuff from the field or the garden. I had plenty of toys, but I also did a lot of playing outside and just a lot of entertain yourself. There was a lot more freedom for kids to run around and do whatever they wanted to do during that time period. There weren't the same frustrations and anxieties as a culture about kidnapping, about molestation, about all of those things. And so while Bone did have those threats in her life, the way that she grew up and the freedom that she grew up with really resonated for me. There were times in the book that I felt like this is moving really slow. Like, this is moving really, really slow. But what I think this book did very, very well, and what I think really came of the slower sections, is that we really get to know Bone's family. We really get to know the adults that she depends on and their attitudes about life. And to some extent, her mom is stuck in a cycle of poverty and abuse. And it's hard for someone who's not been stuck in a cycle of poverty and abuse, I think, sometimes to understand, you know, why can't you just do something different? Why can't you got all these possibilities open to you? But there's something holding, you know, this family lives the way they live. They don't have a lot of options because of the area that they live in. They don't have a lot of options because they don't have much money. There's an innate anger and rebelliousness that kind of leads the uncles to trouble with the law here and there. Things like that. And so I think this book was really great at making that acceptable, normal, something that the contemporary reader can really understand. I knew people like this growing up, certainly. My family was like this. And I lived on the edge of that shift when it was easy for college to be accessible and to do something different and to live a little bit differently. But that was not available to the characters in this book. It wasn't like you could just break out and be a totally different person all of a sudden. So I'm probably explaining that really badly, and I hope doesn't sound offensive or anything, but hard to read in parts, incredibly affecting, impeccable writing. And for me, like I said, it resonated very, very deeply. So I highly recommend this book. If you've had this sort of upbringing, this sort of rural upbringing, or even if you haven't, I think it's a good representation of parts of that experience. And it was just awesome. Like, the end was disappointing. I was disappointed in some of the characters, but it explained so much about them. It made such a statement about them and about this family. I just thought the whole book was great. I thought it was perfect. I gave it 5 stars, no doubt about it. So I've talked about this book for 8 minutes. That's more than enough. I hope that you will pick it up and try it. Bastard Out of Carolina by Dorothy Allison is fantastic. Y'all have a good day. Bye.